So this morning, I realized the fear of every Bible teacher when you arrive at the building and realize you've left your outline at home. I'll tell you how obsessive I am about it. I typically will take a picture of my outline on my phone so that I have a backup. Didn't do that today. So thankfully, my wife is handing out outlines, and so we have an outline to go by. So a lot of today will come from memory. Hopefully, as Stephen prayed, it will be a good recollection. And I'm thankful that we do have an outline. Otherwise, probably wouldn't be very productive this morning. But nonetheless, as we look at the life of Hannah, she is a great example for us as a godly wife, a godly mother, a godly example in that she was the wife under difficult circumstances, a good wife under difficult circumstances, and simply a godly woman, a woman who feared God with all of her heart. And so she's a great example for us, a number of lessons that we can learn. We find the account of her life in the books of 1 Samuel, chapters 1 and 2. And it's an interesting time, I suppose we should say, when we think about the time of Hannah and the fact that it was the end of the period of the Judges. Matter of fact, if you look at Judges chapter 21 and verse 23, the conclusion of that book makes the statement, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so that kind of paints the picture for us as the circumstances, the setting, if you will, of Hannah and Elkanah. Her son Samuel became the last judge of Israel. 1 Samuel 8 tells us about that. And again, you have an understanding when you read just a couple of verses there, a phrase or two, Samuel being the last judge, but in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 8, the statement is made by God, they have not rejected you, Samuel, they have rejected me. The people have demanded a king. And so as we read about Hannah, these are the circumstances, the setting, if you will, of the life that she, or the time that she lived in. You read about Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and it tells us that she was the wife of Elkanah. Evidently, Elkanah was a man of some means. He had two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. And Elkanah was a godly man who worshiped God on a regular basis. He loved Hannah. Verse 5 of the first chapter tells us that he loved her greatly. But Hannah was childless. She had no children. And as you know, at that particular time, the children were the glory of the mother, the glory of the wife. It was such a profound and great and prominent thing for the wife to bear children for her husband. And Hannah had no children, and it was a cause of great grief for her. And to add to her grief, her adversary in verse 6, as Peninnah is described, caused her to fret. Did so year after year, verse 7. And so caused her great sorrow, as a matter of fact. Great sorrow in the life of Hannah because of the fact that she was unable to bear children, and because of Peninnah, her adversary, who caused her great sorrow. She was childless. I think it's so important to realize the response that Hannah has in regard to her sorrow and the grief that was in her life. She turned to God in her grief. She turned to God in prayer, verse 10, and as a matter of fact, she vowed a vow unto God that if you'll give me a son, if you give me a man child, that I will give him back unto you. If you will remember me, are the words that she uses. And you read about her prayer. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting to me, and we're going to make a point about that, verses 12 and following, the silent prayer of Hannah. As a matter of fact, her prayer was silent to the point that Eli observed her praying and thought that she was drunk. He saw her lips moving, but no voice, and he thought that she was drunk. She received a blessing of Eli, and God remembered her, and she bore a son named Samuel, verse 20, and she keeps her vow to God. I think that's also a very important point that we'll try to emphasize. And she offers God a prayer of thanksgiving in chapter 2, and that consists of the first 10 or so verses of chapter 2. I think it's very important also to consider the fact that she prayed to God not only in her sorrow, but also in her joy when God remembered her and gave her a son. And she was blessed to have 5 more children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. And so she was greatly blessed of the Lord in the Lord's time frame. And so that is kind of a summary, if you will, of the story of Hannah that is found in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so as we read about that, we think about the example of Hannah and what are the lessons that we learn about her life or from her life and from her story. She is one, again, that stands in such great contrast to Jezebel, whose every thought was evil and who had such a profound impact not only on her husband and her children and upon her nation. She impacted them for evil. And then we look at the story of Hannah and the impact that she had, not only on her children, on her husband, but as well on her nation, as far as the bearing of her son Samuel and the fact that he was a judge for the final judge and also a prophet of God. And so both of these women, as we look at them, had a great impact on God's people. Hannah continues to have an impact even today as we look at her example. The fact that we can look at her character, we can look at her life and realize that there are so many great characteristics that we can emulate. As we look at those in the beginning, we look at the beautiful spirit of the character of Hannah. What a great example she is. One of the most evident points that we can take away from Hannah is that she was a woman of love. She gave God her son. Not only did she love God, she loved her husband and she loved her children. She was the type of, her love was the type that was not only genuine, sincere, it was sacrificial in the fact that she was willing to give her son. She was active in expressing her love to God and through prayer, but also in the giving of her son. I think about that in the type of love that Hannah had for the Lord was the same type of love that the Lord has for us. He gave his son for us. Hannah gave her son back to the Lord so that he might serve the Lord. I think about 1 John 4 and verse 10 and the statement that is made there in regard to God's love for us and the fact that he gave his son for us. Hannah is a great example in her love of God. But she also loved her husband greatly. She teaches us a great lesson of love, not only in the love of her husband, but her children as well. I think about Titus 2 and verse 4, and I think I cited that in the outline. Teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. Fundamental lesson, isn't it, for the home and the importance of the home, the importance of the mother, and the role of a mother and the role of a wife and a spouse, and the importance of the role that she plays in the institution of the home. And so Hannah was a woman of love. Such a great point when we think about her example of love. She was also a woman of patience. Verses 6 through 9, her adversary provoked her sore for to make her fret because the Lord had shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then said Elkanah, her husband, to her, Hannah, why weepest thou, and why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. And Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And the thought goes on, but when we look at the fact that Hannah was a woman of patience, it's important, I think, to realize exactly what that entails. The definition, if you will, of patience is an abiding under. But not only simply patience, but patience in adversity, the adversity that she faced. Verse 6 again tells us that her adversary, Peninnah, provoked her sorely. You can only imagine how difficult that must have been for Hannah to endure that type of provocation, that type of adversity. Chastisement, I suppose, would be a proper word to use in the trials that she was put through. I think about James chapter 1 and verse 3 and 4 and the statement that is made there in regard to patience, in regard to abiding under. And the emphasis of that verse is that patience only grows through trials. Hannah is a great example of that, the trials that she endured. Patience perfects our Christian character. James chapter 1 tells us as well. And we see the perfecting, if you will, of the character of Hannah in enduring patiently the adversity and the chastisement that she received. She was also a woman of devotion, and that becomes very evident as we look at her example. Devotion through her prayers. I jotted down 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing. And we realize that that's not that we are to be in constant prayer, but in a constant mindset of praying to God and appealing to God and coming to God for the things that we need. We see that example in Hannah. Verse 11 and verse 26 tell us that she vowed a vow unto God. She devoted her son to God. I think it's very interesting verse. I think I failed to jot it down, but the statement that is made, verse 26 of chapter 1. This is after the birth of Samuel, and as she goes to the Lord to give her son, Samuel, to the Lord, notice the statement that she makes. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. Hannah stood by the Lord. What a profound statement that is about her character. But I think we can also say that the Lord stood by Hannah as well. I think about Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6 and Hebrews 13 and verse 5. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And I think Hannah realized that with the devotion that she had and the statement that she made, I am the woman who stood by you. She was also a woman of worship. That becomes evident again from verse 19. The statement that I would make about that, a thought that comes to my mind about the fact that Hannah was a woman of worship, is that she realized the importance of worship. Even though Hannah was in great sorrow, in great grief, chastisement from her adversary, things were not going her way. She did not lose her focus. She realized the importance of worship. And I believe that's a great lesson in and of itself. She did not allow her sorrow to interfere with her worship. She kept her focus on God. Rather than turning away from God in her sorrow and her grief, she turned to God. And I think that's such a great lesson for us when we consider her example and realize how important it is not to lose our focus when difficulty comes our way. The importance of assembling together, the importance of our worship as God has intended us to do, to keep our focus on serving Him and worshiping Him, and how important that is, especially in regard to you and I. I realize that God is the object of our worship, the focus of our worship. But think about the benefit that we derive and the benefit that we receive, the strength that we gain from worship as God has intended to. And I think, again, that Hannah was a great example for us in that regard. She turned to God in worship, not away from God, when difficulty came her way. One of the examples that, one of the points that, the next point that I think about in regard to Hannah, by the way, if you have a comment, please make your comments or ask questions as we go through the lesson. Your input is welcome. Hannah was a woman of self-control. As you look at the definition of self-control, Vine's dictionary describes or defines self-control as the controlling power of the will under the operation of the Spirit of God. The controlling power of the will under the operation of the Spirit of God. I believe that applies especially to Hannah in the fact that she maintained her self-control. Temperance is another word that is used quite often in the New Testament. Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit. Temperance is a part of the fruit of the Spirit. One of the Christian graces in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, temperance. In her provocation, again, she turned to God. She did not respond in anger. She did not respond in an ungodly manner, but rather she exercised self-control and temperance, a sign of her strength, a sign of her faith in God. And when we look at, again, her character, we realize, again, not only was she a woman of love, a woman of patience, devotion, worship, but a woman who exercised a great measure of self-control in the circumstance that she was faced with. And so, another great example, Hannah was also a nurturing mother. Maybe one of the best examples that we have in her character is the fact that she truly was a mother to be exemplified, a mother that we can take great example from. I think about the fact that she weaned her son, verses 21 through 24. She realized the importance of that, expressed that to her husband. It's important for me to stay at home rather than accompanying you until my son is weaned, until the proper time, I believe is the way it's phrased. She prayed for him, verses 26 through 27, and she cared for him. In chapter 2 and verse 19, it says that she went on an annual basis and made him a coat and took it to him. And I think about the fact that she was a nurturing mother. It reflects the strength of character that Hannah had to train her son, to educate him, to instruct him, to also correct him, and to admonish him. All of those would be included in the nurturing mother that she was. The fact that she also prayed for him. I think about that in terms of the fact that a child realizes and knows, and how comforting it is to know that your mother prays for you and that she has you in her prayers. To know that their mother truly does care for them, and the fact that she prays for them. And so Hannah was a nurturing mother, and we see, again, the strength of her character in the fact that she was that. She also sacrificed for her son. Verse 28, she gave him back to the Lord, just as she had vowed, to serve the Lord, and he did so faithfully. And so as we look at the character of Hannah, what a beautiful character it is. And there are a number of points that we can make and bring out from considering her character and her example. Those are just the ones that stand out, at least to me, and the ones that are beneficial, hopefully, to us. Anything you'd like to add or any comment you'd like to make about her to this point? Verse 15, I think it's important for us as we look at, again, the life of Hannah to realize that she was a woman who knew sorrow. verse 15 says, "And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, nor have poured out my soul, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit." I think it's important to emphasize that and to make that point. And we think about that in terms of what caused her sorrow. Not only was it the provocation of her adversary, but the fact, probably even greater, was the fact that she was unable to bear children, that she had a house but not a home, childless, and she was in bitterness of soul. Verse 10 tells us that. I think it's important also to keep in mind that in this particular time, so often when a wife is not blessed with children, it's associated with sin, that it's because of sin in their life, a reproach. And it causes, again, heaviness or grief or anguish. If you look at the sorrow, the definition of the sorrow that Hannah was under at this time, a heaviness or grief or anguish, the fact that she was downhearted even. I think of other examples that are similar to Hannah's. Rachel is one in Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1. The same statement was made in regard to Rachel, unable to bear children at that particular time. Reproach was associated with Job and all the calamity and all the difficulty that he faced. In Job chapter 8, reproach is the word that is used. Even in Luke chapter 1 and verse 25, Elizabeth, the mother of John, the statement that she made there, the Lord, in the birth of John, the Lord has taken away my reproach, the fact that she did not have a son. And so we think about that in terms of Hannah and realize that there were others who suffered the same sorrow, but year by year, she was troubled or provoked by her adversary. But once again, the importance of her response to her sorrow. She poured her soul out before the Lord. I think that's such a profound statement in regard to the sorrow that she experienced. I think about 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 and the statement that is made, "Cast all your care upon him, for he careth for you." That's exactly what Hannah did. She cast her care upon the Lord. She poured her soul out before him. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God." Those are two statements, verses that we can take to heart when we think about Hannah and the example that she experienced such great sorrow. She prayed fervently. That was her response, to turn to the Lord. I think it's also very interesting to keep in mind, not only did she pray fervently when she was in sorrow, but chapter 2 tells us that she prayed just as fervently when joy was brought to her by the Lord. You can see the joy and hear the joy in her prayer and her song in chapter 2. So she was a woman who knew sorrow. Her response to her sorrow was to turn to God and pray fervently and cast her care upon him. That leads us to the next point, and that is that she was a woman of supplication or prayer. I just jotted down about 4 or 5 points in regard to the prayer of Hannah. And I think it kind of summarizes maybe the thought that we want to get across in regard to her prayer. One is that her prayer was her refuge. She turned and prayed to God fervently, even in joy and sorrow. Psalms chapter 9 and verse 9, "The Lord will be a refuge in time of trouble." I think Hannah realized that very thing. Her prayer was also her peace, verse 18, and I think of Philippians 4 and verse 6. And one thing that becomes evident to me, at least in looking at the example of Hannah, is that she believed in the power of prayer. Verse 17 and 18. You notice the statement that it makes there in regard to verse 18 and specifically, and her countenance was no more sad. It changed her heart. Her prayers changed her heart. So she realized the power of prayer. Psalms chapter 19 and verse 14, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer. She realized strength came from God. She was persistent in her prayers. I think that's something that is also a very important point when we think about the importance of praying often, praying fervently, praying persistently to the Lord on behalf of our needs, on behalf of our loved ones, on behalf of the sick, whatever it might be, that we do that persistently. And she was also patient in her prayers. Psalms 27 and verse 14 says, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thy heart. Sometimes it takes patience for us, doesn't it? Sometimes we're not very patient when it comes to what we desire. But we realize that we must have patience also through prayer and waiting on the Lord. And so when we look at her example of prayer, again, we realize prayer was her refuge, her peace, her power. She was persistent in her prayers, and she was also patient in her prayers. A number of lessons that we can take away when we look at, again, the example of Hannah. One thing that's important to me, I believe, and as we look at Hannah, is the particular way that she prayed. I don't know if you paid attention to the statement that was made in verse 12 and following. Came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. He noticed that she was praying. Now Hannah, she spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought that she had been drunken. Don't you find it interesting that Eli observed that Hannah was praying, but his thought was that she was drunk? Her lips are moving, but I don't hear anything coming out of her mouth. But she was praying to the Lord. She prayed in a particular way. Her voice was not heard. She was silent. Her voice was not heard to Eli, but God heard her. It was an unuttered prayer in the fact that Eli couldn't hear her, but God heard her. You know, I think about that in terms of prayer in particular, and for you and I, and what prayer is to us. And we realize the fact that God can hear our thoughts just as easily as he can hear our words, can he? He knows our heart. We realize that, and we realize, again, the importance of prayer. I think about Matthew 6 and verse 6. Do you remember the statement that the Lord made in regard to prayer? When you pray, what did he say to do? Enter into your closet and pray in secret. It's a very personal thing, prayer when we communicate with our Heavenly Father. He can hear our thoughts just as well as he can hear our voice. I think about Psalms chapter 139 and verse 23 when the psalmist said, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. Our Heavenly Father knows our thoughts. We don't have to verbalize our prayer. He knows our thoughts. Jeremiah realized that. I think about Jeremiah in his example in chapter 12 and verse 3, and he said, but thou, O Lord, knowest me, thou hast seen me and tried my heart. Beautiful example when we think of Hannah and the fact that in the particular way that she prayed, it suggests to me a great intimacy with God. The fact that she realized that God would hear her prayer even in thought, that she didn't have to verbalize it. And it suggests to me that she had a great belief in the power of prayer, realize the importance of it. And so we think about that. Again, she is a great example to us in her prayer. Any thoughts on that particular point? The next point, again, lends to the prayer of Hannah, and that is her song or prayer of thanksgiving. It's found in chapter 2. Once again, she was thankful even in her sorrow, but also in her joy. In chapter 2 tells us that very thing. She expresses her gratitude toward God. She praises God for his goodness. Verse 1, my horn is exalted, she said. For his holiness, verse 2, there is none holy as the Lord. For his knowledge, verse 3, he is a God of knowledge. For his action, verse 3, by him actions are weighed. For his power, verses 6 through 9, he killeth and maketh alive. He maketh the poor and the rich. His authority, verses 6 through 10, the pillars of the earth are his, and his sovereignty, verse 10 as well. I think about that, and for just a moment to pause and make a point about her prayer of thanksgiving and what she was thankful for. If you examine that and look at her prayer and the things that she expresses in chapter 2 in regard to God, she thanks God for the blessings toward her. She is thankful, she says. So it's personal in that respect. Hannah prayed, my heart rejoiceth in the Lord. So it was personal to her to express her joy and her thanks to God, his blessings toward her. One of the things that also stands out about that is that she was thankful for the knowledge of God. I think that's an important point, and one that you and I need to be thankful for. We have the knowledge of God. We have the knowledge of his will. We have his inspired word for us. We have every desire that he has for us. We have a knowledge of that, something that we should be thankful for. We are extremely blessed in that regard. That words don't express it properly. The abundance of our blessings in the knowledge of God and knowing him. And also, I think that Hannah was thankful for knowing who God is, and that is expressed in her prayer. But when we think about her song of thanksgiving, truly that's what it was. She expresses all of those things. God's power to us in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 17 through 23. I want to turn over and read a couple of verses here. We think about the accounting in Ephesians chapter 1 of all those spiritual blessings and what he says. But look at how the Apostle Paul concludes the letter, or the thought in chapter 1, not the letter. But here's what he says in regard to his prayer. In verse 16, he says, I cease not to give thanks for you, making mention of you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give unto you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that you may know what is the hope of his calling, and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power to usward, who believe according to the working of his mighty power, which he wrought in Christ when he raised him from the dead and set him at his own right hand in heavenly places, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come, and hath put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all. What a powerful prayer that is, but to realize the knowledge of God, not only the spiritual blessings, but all that we have in our Maker, in God himself. And Hannah expresses those things in her prayer. You can also compare her prayer to the prayer of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 46 and following. The summary statement of Mary's prayer is, he that is mighty hath done to me great things. She realized God's power. She realized God's love. And so, again, when we look at the song of thanksgiving of Hannah, we realize that she was thankful for all of the things that she realized in God and the knowledge of God. Finally, very quickly, she was a woman of sacrifice. She vowed to give her son to the Lord. She didn't forget that vow. Verse 11 says that she vowed that vow. Verse 26 through 28 tells us that that was not an empty vow on Hannah's part. She was sincere in the vow and genuine in the vow that she made. She gave him back to the Lord as she had vowed. And we know that Samuel became an instrumental leader of God's people, a judge, the final judge. He was a circuit judge. He was also a prophet. And so he played an important role in God's plan. And then we think about her sacrifice and the fact that she was also such a beautiful example to her son in her godly character. So, as we look at very quickly, time's going to catch us, but the lessons that we learned from Hannah, there are so many. We went very quickly, but so many lessons that we can learn, the powerful impact of a godly mother. We've already made the comment that you look at her in contrast to Jezebel, an evil mother who taught her children to be evil. What a great example Hannah is in the true character of a mother. Also, the power of prayer. God hears the prayer of the righteous. Hannah is a great example of that. The power of the tongue, that's one lesson that we really didn't touch on, but we look at it in the example of Peninnah. The tongue is powerful both for good and for evil. James chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. The statement is made there, the tongue is a little fire. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth in regard to the tongue. It has the ability to defile the whole body. And then also, I jotted down the last point, the last lesson. Appearances are not always reality. To Eli, Hannah appeared to be drunk, but she was in the depth of her prayer to God. And so, a number of lessons that we can learn. Realize that we went quickly, but thank you so much for your kind attention.